Hello, everybody. Thanks for being here, even though it's talking about the shadow. My topic today is about the shadow in the psychedelic movement and what we can do about it. I'm really happy to be here all the way from Oregon to speak to you about this because it's become a really prescient topic. And I want to begin with a very deeply felt sense of gratitude to the directors of this conference because they've created a very unusual space here wherein we feel the freedom to have deeply honest conversations about the challenges that are facing us in this movement. It's only with this type of genuine invitation to uncover the shadows and learn from them that we can have hope of moving forward into a brighter, more healthy future. So, tremendous thanks to the directors and to all of you for your brave vulnerability to speak for your particular viewpoints and your questions. It can be very nerve-wracking to talk about the shadow. Do any of you ever feel that way? A little bit nervous when the shadow gets brought up? Yeah. During the past few weeks with the big event happening with synthesis ending, we're hearing words like implosion, instability, lack of trust, pain, trauma, collapse. Who's going to get blamed? So it reminds me of that old Amish saying, everyone is a little bit crazy but me and thee, and sometimes I wonder about thee. So when the shadow comes up, humans can get pretty paranoid, and the trust can really break down, and projections of our fears onto others can truly be dangerous. So yes, I don't blame you for being a little bit nervous. The word shadow's on everyone's tongue these days, but very often people are not that good at knowing what to do about it. But I always say it's our best protection to do our shadow work because then we're not in our unconscious, we're not being dangerously naive, and we're healing the misuse of power. So the shadows are always present in our lives. They always are. And the shadow being present in the movement is not a big surprise. It shouldn't be. Whenever there's a great calling to go forward with some new innovation, the shadow is there and it's part of the package. And we have to be able to get the gift out of the shadow in order for the good thing to happen. So what we need is safe spaces for each of us to share all of our particularities and memories. We must speak up because there are subjugated knowledges in each one of us that must be given voice if we're to bring the wisdom ways back. We each have a piece of work to do if we're going to build this community into one of trust and solidarity. So in this movement, I want us to work toward creating that level of safety, which is a big aspiration, but in which each of us might feel safe to speak up for our unique and particular experience and perspectives. This movement proclaims the purpose for these journeys into the unconscious for everybody that's being led into them as it's going to heal their shadow and integrate it for them. So don't you think it really behooves this movement of teachers, leaders, facilitators to walk the talk and take seriously the same processes of healing all the relationships in this larger community of this movement? We each might have our particular people that trigger us, and think about that, that's your particular shadow that you might be being called to work on. Well, there's three basic guidelines to how we might make safe containers around doing the shadow work. Three basic ground rules. The first one is no blaming. Now that sounds strange because whenever we think about the shadow, it seems like we're pointing the finger at somebody. But I always say step number one or shadow work 101 is taking self-responsibility. So if you are still blaming others and feel angry or defeated or like running away, like fight, flight, freeze, fawn, it's okay. But it just means that you are in the phase of studying your shadow. And that's just the point. You have to see what all of your emotions are when the shadow is triggering you. But then when you're ready, you take this step of self-responsibility and enter into the work of the shadow, which I'll be talking more about in a few minutes, how to do that. And the second ground rule is that the only reason that we would delve into the shadow is to follow a clear intent for authentic healing. Otherwise, don't go there. Our general intent in talking about the shadow must always be to bring about the possibility of healing the fractures and the hurts, the separations in our relational world. Through shadow work, we can come through to a more honest communication style and sustainable community. Doing our shadow work is our best protection. That's the only way that the dysfunctional patterns are going to come to an end. And another point, a third point about how to make the realm safe for doing the shadow work is go slow. We have to study the shadow for a long time for it to come to ripeness and really shift. My Huichol teacher, Guadalupe, taught me that the shadow is a slippery fish, and if not handled carefully, it can get away or it can capsize the boat. As a Jungian depth psychologist, I appreciate how Carl Jung pointed out that the shadow is a complex. There are these literally neurological clumps in our brains, like knots, that must be unthreaded slowly and carefully. Like a delicate gold necklace, we have to unwind the puzzle with astute care so the necklace doesn't break. The blockages in the neuron structures of our minds require that same slow, careful attention. Carl Jung said, it's imperative that we hold the shadow's complexity long enough without coming to premature foreclosure. And that's the way that we come through to maturity. It takes time for the body and the unconscious to reveal what it needs us to remember. And there's an orderliness to it. We can trust our inner guidance system to lead us to the right memories that we'll have in the right moment. This is a diagram that I created to help us to be on the same page about what the shadow's all about. I created this to try to explain how the shadow comes about in us humans. For me, it came from a quantum physics experiment that I read about, where scientists were sending a coherent beam of light towards a wall. And they wanted to see if when it had to split to go around the wall, would it continue to go out infinitely? Or how soon would it want to come back together? So when they sent that beam of light, it split. But very soon after it got around the wall, it came back together. So I think that's the same thing that's happening in our human personalities, that we have a split that occurs and then we're looking for a safe enough container for our personality to be healed. So let's talk about how this happens on a human level. So we're born into this planet trailing streams of glory, like the poet Wordsworth says, coming from a wholeness. And I believe that we actually choose our incarnational destiny path. And at some point, maybe right in the womb or sometime shortly after that, we run into trauma situations where we get hurt. Let's take a severe case like child sexual abuse. So if a child has that big trauma, their self cannot handle it, cannot understand it. And so the perpetrator would be saying to them something like, be a good girl and don't tell anybody. So right there, you see the beginning of the split. The persona becomes being a good girl, being very good to everybody and taking care of everybody and not letting there be any problems. And the shadow becomes, but I can't talk about it. I have to be quiet. Maybe I can't even remember it after a while. So the voice, the no, the boundary setting goes into the shadow. And codependency and people pleasing goes into the persona. Then I draw that squiggly line down the middle to show that this is an unstable setup and that our human personality can't really maintain that. The shadow will start to leak out, and if you don't address it, it'll come out sideways and really trip you up. So humans are looking for a place that's safe enough, and a lot of times we look for the safety in a love relationship. But that's good. And our partners can love us and allow the shadow things to start coming out. But the problem is they've got their shadow too, and people are usually drawn to each other and their shadows are intersecting and interacting. So it might not be ultimately a safe container. I call that mutual soul retrieval, though, that you're there to help one another to heal, but really you need a safe container. And so people in olden times used to go to the edge of their society and meet with the shaman when they were in this situation. Nowadays we go to a therapist. So you need a very safe container to hold what has to happen next, which is the deconstruction of the persona, and the shadow has to arise. And so then when that happens and it can all be worked through, you can come back into a coherency and integration. So do you like that description of the shadow? Yeah, it helps to understand it in a simple way, doesn't it? Well, I appreciate the session that I attended yesterday on this stage in the afternoon. We heard brilliant presentations by David Luke, Ness Deveneaux, Don Kyman, and Dennis Walker. And they bravely cracked open forthright conversations about some of the shadow aspects happening in the psychedelic Renaissance movement. Dan did a great job yesterday of listing the shadow issues that have come out of the synthesis collapse. And I agree with his analysis and do stand in solidarity with his speaking out. And I want to say that because it's difficult to be brave and name what the shadow is publicly. And because Dan and others yesterday and today, the speakers that have spoken have done such a good job at naming the shadow. We need to let them know, thank you. Thank you for being brave to do that. Dan and I were together in synthesis as the shadow began to heat up. We worked together along with others creating the synthesis training program. My part was leader of the wisdom track, designing, writing, and teaching the wisdom track sessions. So my mission was to honor elders in this field from all traditions, and particularly indigenous people who have held this wisdom often at great cost. This was more than just a job for me, because I'm also one of those elders who's embodied the teachings with such dedication and sometimes at great personal cost. So in my role, I was both working very hard to bring across authentic wisdom teachings and how they can really help us in understanding altered states. But the undercurrent in the organization was difficult at times, and so it was like an energy drain. So I was constantly calling on members of the organization to slow down and consider the implications of saying that this training was fully preparing students to be psychedelic facilitators. The indigenous elders that I brought in were confirming this, saying that this format could only be just a brief introduction and much longer apprenticeship process was needed. Behind the scenes, I was trying to hold different leaders accountable, both in their legal contract structures to not be appropriating the IP of myself and the indigenous elders, and they did change the contracts. As time went on, ethical communications became sorely lacking, and I wrote a 10-page letter explaining how the human resources practices were illegal and needing improvement, thinking that they would be thankful for my efforts, but the leader of the training team never read it and canceled several meetings with me to talk about it. So at that point, another one of the leaders asked me, well, what will happen if we don't do our shadow work? I said, it will only thicken up. So that's what we watched it doing. Really thick, sticky, painful goo. The end came quicker than I thought it would to synthesis. And several of us have wondered if maybe psilocybin, the trickster, had something to do with that, with the swiftness of the finality and the comeuppance of the shadow work not done. So I'm sad for the way it happened and for all those that were hurt, and we're thankful that a big halt has come. But all the problems in the way that synthesis operated are typical to most startups. Business structures operate in these pressured ways. It's called churning and burning in the corporate world of employees and overpromising for marketing purposes. And that's the way that businesses do it throughout our current economic system. So We're talking here about an overhaul of our economic systems. Climate change and economist leaders recently met in Geneva, and they actually admitted this, that there needs to be a radical change in our economic systems around the world. Somehow the psilocybin movement made us have the hopes that this time, because we're dealing with such a sacred product, maybe it will be different. Many of us have discussed how the psilocybin trickster energy will be listened to, even if by toppling organizations. So we are working with something different here that may be our hope, you know? What happened in synthesis is worth talking about. And I'm not going to go on any more about it right now, but I encourage people to talk about it because it's a big shadow event for the whole movement. And here at this conference, it's what I had hoped for could happen. It's a place where we can stop and people can meet with one another and talk openly and compassionately while taking self-responsibility and see what can be learned to really make the future different and a better one. A few suggestions that I have for best practices for equitable workplaces that came from me out of my work in the women's movement days. Picture a workplace like this. And wouldn't you like to work in one where there's transparency in naming and valuing differences? Where we can name power dynamics and privilege differentials clearly and upfront? Where we could have clear agreements on the intentions, purposes, and desired outcomes for our meetings? Where we could establish and agree on group norms and codes of ethics ahead of time? Where we could encourage embodied awareness, because our bodies rarely lie. Representation matters, seeing others who look like oneself or who have similar diversities, and prioritize relationship before tasks. And finally, doing ritual together at work, because ritual creates relationship. We take time in our workplaces to pay attention to the explicate order, but how much attention do we pay to the implicate order? We're in ordinary reality in our workplaces, but the dream time is going on simultaneously. And so we need to pay attention to all those other messages coming in the workplace, right? Well, what can be done? What can be done about the shadow in our movement? I'm going to talk to you now about a little bit more in depth for a minute about my own life, because in not talking about synthesis anymore, we're moving to a place where we can talk more in depth about the particularities of our own lives. These are drum heads because I'm going to be talking to you about drumming. As a child, I was delightfully frequently in altered states of consciousness, both in times of waking and sleeping. I was immersed in a truly fascinating, esoteric, supernatural environment that was truly a safe container created by my family and spiritual community. My grandmother on one side, great-grandmother and great-aunt on the other side had stepped out of dominant religion in the 1920s and formed this temple church called the Tabernacle in inner city Buffalo, where Black women, white women, and all the men that supported them came together to experience supernatural things. And they were very psychic, and they held a safe container for the body and that altered state sense to be present there. So when I was a kid, I was very clairvoyant, clairsentient. I had vivid memories of other lifetimes and other dimensions in which I also lived. And I was going through portals and beings were coming through portals to me. That's normal childhood. And so many people don't get to have that kind of support in their childhood. All went well until I was about 12, when one evening a visiting male minister came to our church and went into an intense altered state. And then he came out from it and called me up in front of the whole congregation. And he said he was going to do an exorcism on me. He said that he was casting out the demon of homosexuality. Well, I didn't even know what that word meant, but I just figured that obviously it meant something really, really bad. And yet I knew I wasn't really, really bad, but it sent me into a shadow spin that took years to unfurl. As it turned out, I owned being queer, gender fluid when I was in college. So there was something real that he was tuning into there. But the way he took the power over me and shamed me publicly, that was the beginning of a whole life of being blamed and shamed for something that was just who I was. And it was a challenging thing to own it back then, when times weren't open to it at all. So what I experienced when I was 12 years old, that aggressive authority, spiritual authority, telling me something about myself, pushing me to a shadow situation that I hadn't even thought about yet or come into contact with, was a real boundary crossing. And it's just an example, though, of how the shadow coming in our lives then can have a really positive effect, because little did he know, but he was sending me on a lifelong career path as a researcher of the psychology of religious experience. And I became a firebrand for the oppressed and for not crossing boundaries and doing accurate shadow work. I came into this movement in a little bit different way because of my interest in mysticism. I was searching in the texts of the time, and there was not much written back in the 70s about the body in religion or mystical experiences, only St. John of the Cross. So I determined that I had to travel all over the world to find out from elders about mystical consciousness. And I ended up going to live in Japan and be in South America and Central America, and got to study with incredible human beings who are very attuned to the altered states. This year, I read the book The Immortality Key by Brian Murray Rescue, and it's an important book to read in our times because he uncovers that in our European history, there were wise, advanced beings like this too. We, in Western culture, are all thinking that we've got to go far and wide to find these skills and these abilities, and yet we've got to look at why and what's happened in Western culture. So please read The Immortality Key, because he talks about the fact that women were the leaders of the entheogenic practices, but they also were doing drumming. Drumming was the main thing that they did to take people into altered states, and the entheogens were just done occasionally for a special, deeper work. So in 1979, when Michael Harner came back from the Amazon, I was one of the first people to get to study with him and be guided into how to do drumming journeys to take people into altered states. And I've been doing it ever since. So I've done it with thousands of people. And I actually created a methodology called the Journey to Completion, which is a whole pathway that we can walk to go down into the dream time. We always will meet an animal being that's our guide, and we'll study the shadow, and we'll transmute the shadow and come through practicing the change in perspective and come back to our community from the liminal space and have a celebration feast. So I'm just saying this very briefly, and it is my trademarked process, and you can find out more about it by at the end. I'll have a QR code. But Dan yesterday was talking about how one of the things we need in the movement is apprenticeship training programs that are accurate to indigenous wisdom and also to how the unconscious really works. So I spent many years, studying psychology and the psychology of religions and studying with wonderful teachers all over the world to come up with this methodology. But I always give the most credit to Guadalupe de los Rios, who was my Huichol teacher. I say I got my PhD in shadow work with her. So I want to encourage you to go out from here and look into drumming as a way to go into an altered state. a special type of shamanic drumming because it takes us into a lucid, non-ordinary state. I also want to encourage you to be aware of your dreams because your dreams are always presenting you with the shadow material that you must look at. I also want to encourage you, if you have any sense of it happening, to pursue lucid dreaming because lucid dreaming is another state of being present in consciousness in the same way that you're present in the lucid dreaming through lucid state through drumming journeys. So we have access to the altered states of consciousness in ways that have gone out of practice, but that used to be the preliminaries to doing entheogens. I think that might be a little bit of a shadow in this movement because we talk about drug-seeking behavior sometimes, that people think you have to have a substance to help you go to these states. But we are programmed, we are created to have tremendous access to the mystical states. So your shadow transmutation. That's what I am encouraging you to set out upon if you haven't already. But you have a particular aspect of the shadow that you may be being triggered by, whether it has to do with this movement or in your life. But that is yours to grapple with, and as a human alive right now, to bring that particular aspect of the shadow through to its transmutation. We're all here to complete our incarnational destiny, and this is the way you do it. So now is the time to do this important work because we are on a precipice. We talk about that synthesis went over a precipice. Well, lots of our systems are on that type of edge. I didn't get time to go into detail about how you do the transmutation work, just time to give you a glimpse of it. But get in touch with me if you'd like. I'm going to show you the QR code. So find out more about this work, the journey to completion. And also down there in the corner is a book that's coming out that my daughter and I have written on advanced lucid dreaming skills. It's written in conjunction with an oracle deck so that you can learn in a nonlinear, intuitive way how to go into advanced lucid dreaming. So thank you.